In this video, we are talking about corporate strategy. You might ask, I've been in this class a month. Haven't we been talking about corporate strategy for a month? Well, yes and no. Corporate strategy is a common umbrella term to refer to all aspects of business strategy. But business strategists themselves like to make a further distinction and talk about business or competitive strategy versus corporate strategy. Everything we've studied to date in this class is really focused on business or competitive strategy. Questions of how to compete in a single market. We've danced around some questions of corporate strategy, but haven't really done it in a rigorous way yet. So corporate strategy, by contrast, asks the question, what markets should we compete in? So what range of products or services should our business offer? What geography should we compete in? And this is certainly related to competitive strategy. You might remember the acronym PARTS: players, added values, rules, tactics, and scope. And when you change the range of products or services you offer or the geography you compete in, you're certainly changing the scope of your business. And that also has knock-on effects, oftentimes for the players involved, possibly the rules of the game. But when we look at these questions through the lens of corporate strategy, we're thinking about the firm not just as one player in one market, but as a configuration of possibly many different business units that compete in many different markets. And that brings up a second question, which is also, how do you organize your business to best compete? Because there's not just one way to structure a business. There are many different ways to structure a business. So let's dive into that first question first, which is, which markets should you compete in? The readings for today gave you two different perspectives. Cullis and Montgomery, who you might recall are big proponents of the resource-based view of the firm, take a resource-based approach. So they say choosing what to do and where to compete really should be based on a business's underlying resources. So what is the business best at based on their resources and capabilities? Those things we call core competencies. A business should identify a core competency, and then the various industries or markets that they choose to compete in should be ones that play to their strengths, their core competency. And core competencies can be very broad and applicable to many markets, or very niche and narrow and applicable only to one or few. And that would kind of have a cascade effect with how a business organizes itself in Cullis and Montgomery's perspective. Cullis and Montgomery, I'll also note, focus a lot on the relatedness of the underlying resources that it takes to produce a good or service, and not necessarily similarities between the products or services themselves. On the other hand, Porter gives us a kind of pragmatic approach to thinking about diversification, and he gives us just 3 tests to consider. The first is attractiveness. If you're considering, or if your business is considering entering a new industry, is that industry attractive? Perform a 5 forces analysis, and that should give you your answer, or at least part of your answer. Better off. Will your business be better off for some reason by entering a new market? So this question also relates a little bit to how you choose to enter that new market, whether it's through acquiring an existing competitor in that new market or growing into that new market organically. But if you, for example, acquire an existing competitor in a different market, you might be asking questions of, are there synergies? Are we both better off by operating together than by remaining 2 separate entities? And the third question is cost of entry, which again, it depends on how you choose to diversify, whether that's through acquisition, because then you quite clearly know the purchase price, versus growing the capabilities in-house. So building a new set of capabilities can also be very expensive, whether it requires building a new factory, hiring new talent, It can also be slow. So in both instances, there is a cost to entering a new market. And so far, I've used the term entering a new market or diversification to refer to a business expanding beyond a single industry. So no longer competing in just one single industry, but moving into a different industry. Not all moves into different industries are the same. So I want to introduce a few new vocabulary words to categorize these different types of diversifications or corporate combinations. So let's harken back to the Coca-Cola case. When Coca-Cola acquired its bottlers, this was a type of diversification, but a particular type of diversification we called vertical integration, because they were moving along the value chain and purchasing not a competitor, but in this case, technically a customer, kind of a supplier. So it's another necessary and critical part of their value chain, but it is not the same exact industry as Coca-Cola or Pepsi. So if you take the Colas and Montgomery perspective of competing on resources, the resources needed to be a good bottler and those needed to be a good CSD producer may be a little bit different, but there are reasons to understand vertical integration is kind of a separate or slightly special case of corporate combinations. So now imagine the hypothetical that Coca-Cola tried to acquire Pepsi. Unlikely, but possible. That we would call horizontal integration. When you hear people talking about mergers, they're oftentimes talking about horizontal integration, which is purchasing a direct competitor in the same industry. This isn't diversification because you're not moving into a different industry, but it's another type of corporate combination. And because we talk about these different actions of corporate combination, mergers, acquisitions, growing organically into a new market, oftentimes together, it's important to understand horizontal integration as well. Next, there's the concept of diversification. So if Coca-Cola were to go buy Keebler, which makes snack foods, this would be a form of diversification because they would be moving into a unrelated industry. Let's set aside diversification for a minute and talk about the special case of vertical integration. So I already gave you the example from the Coca-Cola case. When Coca-Cola purchased its bottlers, that was an example of vertical integration. Firms can either move backward in their value chain or forward, which is called forward integration, and that's a step closer to the customer. In either instance, the question for vertical integration is really what's more beneficial, to make or to buy a service or some sort of intermediary step in your value chain. So Favaro tells us that you should go ahead and vertically integrate and make when there's a market failure you can address, or when this kind of integration gives you some form of competitive advantage. The flip side to vertical integration is taking steps of your value chain and moving them out, and instead of doing them in-house, transacting with a firm outside of your business. This is more commonly called outsourcing. So you can use the same questions to analyze whether vertical integration makes sense to think about whether the opposite of that, outsourcing, also makes sense. Another way to traditionally look at this question of whether to vertically integrate, do something in-house versus transact on the market is using the Coase theorem. And so Coase basically came up, he was an economist, and he came up with certain conditions about when it was better to do things in the firm versus to transact on the market. I won't walk through all of this, but it's an important kind of founding economic principle about why businesses or firms exist in the first place. Just some things are more efficient and effective to do when you're in one organization, and some things are less efficient and effective to do. There are transaction costs to interacting on the market, right? Every time you need something done, you have to go out and put out a request for proposals, etc. But there's a lot more flexibility to transacting on the market, for example. You also have higher powered incentives, so it's easier to fire a contractor for poor performance. So those market-based relationships can incentivize both parties to behave differently than maybe if they were all in-house under one roof and one firm. I'd also like to point out, though, that there aren't just two choices here. You can't just do something in-house or transact on the market, what we'd call a spot transaction or arm's length transaction on the market. There are other forms of semi-strong integration. Businesses can use short-term contracts or licensing and franchising arrangements. So Coca-Cola used some aspect of both contracts and exclusive franchising with bottlers. So even before they acquired bottlers and took them in-house, they weren't really transacting at an arm's length. A deeper form of integration might be something like a joint venture. And there are also other forms of strategic alliances that we'll continue our discussion of next week.